Hi everyone, I'm Virginia. I'm a senior product manager working within the biometrics team at Onfido, now Entrust. And I actually got into the space a few years ago now, 4.5 years ago, starting as an analyst, still within my same team. But I was working with the biometrics team trying to improve our product. And then from then, I've moved into the product space where I'm now sort of at the forefront of trying to of our fraud prevention strategy and trying to make our product as robust as possible against some of the latest fraud attacks we're seeing within the industry.
Thank you so much. And I know that biometrics and identity verification are major areas of focus in your career. With the current release of Entrust 2026 Identity Fraud Report, could you walk us through some key insights and highlights from that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are three main takeaways that we're hoping to share this year. I think the first one is maybe an obvious one, and it's around how AI is becoming a key enabler for fraud. I think one of the more, I guess in my team, one of the more interesting statistics was that we are now seeing deepfakes make up actually 1 in 5 of our biometric attack vectors. And so we're seeing that obviously become more and more prevalent within our fraud distribution. Another one that I think is really interesting to highlight is that although we are seeing this shift over the last few years, our verification methods are getting stronger. And so fraudsters are always trying to find the path of least resistance. And so what we're seeing is that fraudsters are actually trying to leverage social engineering and coercion, basically manipulating real people to give up their identity, their biometrics, to be used essentially, usually as mules, unfortunately, for fraud. So we're seeing them actually start to leverage more and more social engineering and coercion. So putting real people in front of the camera, you can imagine what better way than to fool an identity verification system than to put a real person. And so we are starting to see that as an attack vector, and it's becoming very important for us to look into that. And the final, I guess, trend that I think is worth highlighting for everyone is that as we've been expanding our coverage in our IDV from more of an onboarding to more authentication, we've been looking at how fraud differs across the identity lifecycle. And we are seeing that in certain industries, the fraud is very much driven by where the highest level of reward is. So, in industries like crypto, where you have a lot of reward up front, you'll see a lot more fraud at onboarding. Whereas in the payments industry, you will see a lot of the fraud happening after the onboarding.
I'm wondering if you could share a pivotal moment or turning point that shaped your journey into this industry of tech and identity.
I think one of the most pivotal moment that shaped my career was actually when I entered the tech space and the identity space. I actually did my master's in chemistry and was finishing that off. And I was really curious and wanted to try something new after my studies. And so this is when I started to get interested in the tech space. And the curiosity actually led me into Onfido, now Entrust at the time, about 4 years ago. And like I mentioned, started working as an analyst. And I was purely focused on data and performance, as I mentioned. And so as I was analyzing this data and started to see some of key new fraud types come about, that was when everything really clicked for me. I guess I realized that we weren't just building software solutions. We were actually, real gatekeepers. There are millions of people who actually rely on our services every single day, and generally in the industry to access. And so, I could see that any small change or any change we made or any model decision threshold that we changed could have such an impact on everyday people.
And that really leans into the work that we do here with women and identity. So I was just interested in hearing more about what is it about women and identity that speaks to you in your personal life and in your career?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a lovely question. I think it's very important to me because identity systems, quite literally, as I mentioned, give people access to anything. So getting a loan, getting a cross-border control, getting access to a bank. So if those systems aren't built by taking diverse perspectives into account, things like bias mitigation, obviously, which we talk a lot about, the risk isn't just, a technical failure happening and having to fix that. It is someone who is actually excluded from accessing a system. And so, as I mentioned just a few seconds ago, I think, when we make decisions about design or thresholds or risk tolerance in these systems, these have literally direct impacts on who gets through to access the service and then who actually gets blocked. And so I really love, I guess, your mission, because it really champions making sure that we bring these conversations really to the surface and like top of mind, because we are all increasingly relying on this digital space, this digital identities. And so I'm very much very, very aligned with, how important inclusion is for our industry.
And lastly, if you could sit across from a tech or identity leader who just doesn't get inclusive design, what would you say to them to make them change their mind?
I think I'll take an example from earlier this year. We've actually been making changes to our motion capture experience. It's just a biometric capture experience. And at the very beginning, when we were still doing some informal testing, we do what maybe a lot of teams do, is we actually share prototypes between each other, but we also started to share them with our parents. So I would, shared my build, our team's build with my dad, who actually was able to get through it quite successfully and pretty easily. But I could see that, I guess my mum was struggling. And then a few, I guess, soon after, I had a conversation with our designer, who also said that he had a very similar experience with his dad. And so this was starting to feel like it wasn't just a one-off. So it was just something that was in the back of my head, I guess. And so we then moved into our proper testing processes. We do, thorough user testing on larger scale across different demographic groups. And lo and behold, from the data we get, we get this data back, and we see that actually for users who were over the age of 45, they actually had a lower first-time success rate. So they were actually, the product technically worked, but it wasn't working equally for all the different groups that we'd tested. And so we spent some time after that with the team, engineering and design, to look at improving it. So we looked basically at things like better preparing users from the very beginning, so they know what to expect. Also giving people a bit more time throughout the capture. A lot of things when it comes to identity is about speed, but sometimes you need to just give people a bit of time to get acquainted with an experience that they might not necessarily be used to. And so after the changes, we ran a follow-up study with also focus group on 45 plus, and we actually saw a really, really good improvement in first-time success. And so those changes are now going into our latest build. But I think what it really highlights is that inclusive design isn't just about fixing edge cases or ticking boxes. It's about noticing that there are people who may struggle with your experience and just taking that very seriously and trying to fix it.